coming back to discuss where we had left in the last session. This is block 3, unit 10, unit 10, that we are going to discuss something about collective bargaining. And the structure of our 1 hour session would be, I'll be giving introduction about collective bargaining. Then I will touch upon the meaning and concept of collective bargaining. Then we will discuss something about the functions of collective bargaining and to follow the structure, nature, and content of collective bargaining. Apart from that, also, we will talk about the types of collective bargaining and what are the various theories, what are the elements, and we'll try to sum it up. So after hearing all these, a student will be able to understand the meaning and the concept of collective bargaining. Student will be able to explain the structure and process of collective bargaining. And apart from that also, a student will be able to describe, not only describe something about collective bargaining, but also the types and the theories associated to it. So let me start with the introduction. Whenever we are talking of collective bargaining, obviously this is something which is originated in the writings of your Sydney and Beatrice Webb. He was a famous historian of the British labor movement, and that too towards the end of your 19th century. And in fact, it was the first, I would say, currency. It was the first currency which was given in the United States by Samuel Gramper. So collective bargaining is a process of your joint decision making and basically representing some kind of democratic way of life in industry. And it establishes a culture. What kind of culture? Culture of your bipartisan and culture of emphasizing more on your joint consultations in industry. And apart from that also, one will have a kind of flexible method of adjustment to economic changes taking place, to technical changes taking place in an industry. So it all helps in establishing industrial peace, industrial harmony, and that too without disrupting either the existing arrangements made or the production activities normally continued in the organizational setup. So with this introduction, let me touch upon what do you mean by collective bargaining? What is the concept of collective bargaining? As a matter of fact, collective bargaining is always defined. If I go to encyclopedia of your social sciences as a process, and it is a process of a discussion, it is a process of negotiation between two parties, one or both of whom is a group of persons have to be there, and that too acting in concert. So the resulting bargain that you get, that is an understanding as to the terms and conditions, whatever terms and conditions you agree upon, under which some kind of continuing service is to be performed. So more often what we come across specifically, it would be better. Collective bargaining is always looked at as a procedure, and in that procedure, the employer and a group of employees, they what they do, they always agree upon what are the conditions of work. So, as for the Stephens version, we define collective bargaining as a social control technique, and social control technique for reflecting the basic power relationship, social control technique for transmitting the basic power relationship, because that is going to underlie the conflict of interest in an industrial relation system. So the definition itself, if we analyze, emphasizes the important characteristics of your collective bargaining, that it is always concerned with the application of power in the adjustment of your inherent conflicts of interest. So that is why Webb described collective bargaining in another way as an economic institutions with the trade unionism, which is acting as a, I would say, labor cartel by controlling entry into the trade. Similarly, it reminds me that Professor Alan Flanders has argued, on the other hand, that the collective bargaining is primarily a political rather than an economic process. So, while talking of political rather than an economic process, he described collective bargaining as a power relationship, and that power relationship between whom? Between a trade union organization and the management organization. Because always there is a tussle, because there is a conflict of interest. So through joint consultation, you try to arrive at a conclusion. You always try to arrive at an agreement. So the agreement arrived at is a compromise settlement. It is a compromise settlement of power conflicts. Similarly, in Flanders' view was that collective bargaining is nothing but a joint administration, which is very much synonymous with your joint management. So that is the case why when we talk about collective bargaining, which has been described by famous Dubin as the great, I would say, social invention that has institutionalized industrial conflict. And it is a kind of right which is or should be the prerogative of every worker in a democratic society. So, having heard all these things, I would say it may be defined as a method of determining the terms of employment, as a method of determining the conditions of employment. And apart from that, also, we need to look at what is the regulatory body and what is the regulating mechanism regulating the employment relationship, which utilizes the process of negotiation between the representatives of management and representatives of your employees, those who are intended to result in an agreement and subsequently which may be applied across the group of employees. So if I look at the Marxists, they contend that your collective bargaining is nothing but merely a means of social control within industry and an institutionalized expression of the class struggle between the capital and labor, and that too in capitalist societies. So it is a method by which management and the labor they may explore each other's problem and viewpoints. They must explore each other's viewpoint and finally to develop a kind of framework, develop a kind of employment relations, to develop a kind of spirit of cooperation, trying to develop a kind of goodwill for the mutual benefit. So it has been described as a civilized bipartite confrontation between the workers and the management, and the very purpose is to arriving at an agreement so that we can have industrial harmony, so that we can have industrial peace. So in brief, we can describe this collective bargaining as a continuous process, collective bargaining as a continuous dynamic process, and the very purpose is to solve problems which are arising directly out of the your employer and employee relationship. So there are some concepts of your collective bargaining with the different emphasis. There are some concepts of collective bargaining with different stress. Namely, you can talk about the marketing concept. You may talk about the governmental concept. You may talk about the industrial relation or the managerial concept. So if I speak from marketing concept views, so I look at collective bargaining as the means and by which labor is bought. I look at collective bargaining as a means by which labor is sold in the market. So buying and selling of labor taking place in the marketplace. So in this context, collective bargaining is perceived as an economic relationship. Collective bargaining can be perceived as an exchange relationship. So this concept focuses on the substantive content of the collective bargaining. That means uh, focuses on the pay aspect, focuses on the hours of work aspect, focuses on the fringe benefits aspect, and because all these which are very much mutually agreed upon between the employers and the trade union representatives, and all these things happening on behalf of their members. And if I look at the governmental concept of collective bargaining, on the other hand, or the regards that we talk about, because that regards the institution as a constitutional system of rule making process, because that is going to determine the relation between your management and the trade union representatives. So here, collective bargaining is always seen as a political relationship, is always seen as a power relationship. So industrial relation, when we are talking of, or the you can talk about the managerial concept of collective bargaining. They view entirely in a different way. They view the institution as a participative decision making, and that too, that participative decision making taking place between the employees and the employers on the matters on which both the parties have vital interest. So, after giving the meaning attached to collective bargaining and the concept of collective bargaining, it is high time to talk about the functions of collective bargaining. And when we talk about the functions, I would say that collective bargaining serves a number of important functions. You may start with it is a rule making, or you may talk about it is a kind of legislative process in the sense that it formulates terms of your employment, it formulates the conditions of your employment, and on the basis of which your employment is being governed by the organizations. So you talk about labor, you talk about management, they may cooperate, they may also work together over a certain period which is already stated in your letter of employment. So this discussion is a kind of, you can say, judicial process. And when we are talking of judicial process, it is for in every collective agreement, there is always a provision of uh, or you keep some kind of clause regarding the interpretation of the agreement and how they are different, how any difference of opinion, when we are talking of difference of opinion about the intention or a difference of opinion regarding the scope of a particular clause, that is to be resolved. So it is also an executive process. When I say executive process, both as management, uh, also from your trade unionisms, because in most of the cases, what we have seen that the interpretation, when we go for interpretation of the agreement and how any differences of opinion about the intention and scope of a particular cause is to be solved, and being a kind of executive process, and process as both management and the union, they undertake to implement, no doubt about it, they undertake to implement the agreement which is signed between them. So John Dunlop and the Derek Bock, they have listed five important, normally the functions of collective bargaining. So the first function would be that you're establishing the rules of the workplace, so that that will be the same for everybody, and all are very much desirable to maintain the time aspect. So that will indicate their respect for the system which the organization is looking for. So in the process, when we look at what are the functions being discharged, the first which is striking to my mind, that you're establishing the rules of the workplace. And apart from that, also one has to define what should be the terms of companies. And in addition to that, also standardizing the compensation part cannot be ruled out, and the priorities, determining the priorities on each side has to be taken into consideration. And finally, redesigning or redesigning rather, which will be more appropriate in this context, that redesigning the machinery slash you can say um, this machinery of bargaining process. So, according to Flanders, way back in 1974, your collective bargaining serves two employees' interest. One is market control. So, by negotiating any pay and any conditions that are more or less, you can talk about their standard, and employers effectively, they always try to manage, they try to take cost of one of the uh, most important factor of productions out of your competition. And the second interest, um, that is being served by the collective bargaining is some kind of contributions to management control. So in this way, you can talk about the various functions being discharged, the process. Now coming to the structure of collective bargaining, as a matter of fact, collective bargaining structure, when we talk about, it refers to your regularized pattern of union management interaction. It refers to your regularized pattern of union management network. It refers to your network of institutionalized bargaining or institutionalized bargained relationship. Because, my dear student friends, it indeed, we are all more concerned about whenever there is a bargain. Every bargain structure comprises of bargaining levels, bargaining units, and the bargaining forms apart from the scope of bargaining. And when we talk about bargaining level, for example, maybe on a national basis, maybe on a district basis, maybe on a company basis, maybe on a plant basis, maybe on a sub-plant basis. But one thing we have to keep in mind, that bargaining units, on the other hand, relate to the groups of employees, which are very much covered by a particular set of bargaining arrangements, which are all covered by a particular set of collective agreements that you have gone for. For instance, let me give you one example that in one organization or in one industry, all manual workers may be covered by the same collective agreement. So while in any sort of agreement, whenever you go for, and while in another organization or industry with different categories of manual workers may have their own separate agreements altogether. Similarly, there may be separate agreements altogether covering the manual, covering the non-manual employees. So you have bargaining forms, and the bargaining forms they describe the bargain, describe different agreements. Normally, you have gone for, and these are all written. These are all formal. On the one hand, on the other hand, you have your unwritten, something which is not written, informal on the other. So bargaining scope, if you look at, is very much concerned with the uh, range of objects covered in a particular negotiation. So that is why it is a possible, it is always possible. I have a different kind of feeling in this regard, that it is possible to identify at least two distinct categories or two distinct elements that may exist with your collective bargaining or collective structure. And first, there are national multi-layer bargaining arrangements, and normally the second, there is a single employer enterprise or organizational level bargaining. And if you look at the national multi-employer bargaining, has been particularly a feature of collective approach to any kind of industrial relation in any form, in any form of segment of some countries. So such a system leads to negotiation at industry, or such a system leads to negotiation in some organization at different levels. So this type of practice in most of the Western Union, or you can say Western European countries, generally they refer to multi-employer agreement, and these are all negotiated between the national and your employers association. So because if you are talking of employers association which is covering that employees of a given description in a specified industry or sub-industry, but at the same time, when you talk about simple or single employer organizational bargaining, so that may exist. In the both the cases, and in both the cases what we have seen, that single employer organizational bargaining, that means it is at the enterprise level, that may exist at the only, or the, you can say, predominant from bargaining structure that normally we have gone for in some industries, normally we have gone for in some countries. But what is understood, that both the USA and Japan, the developed nations, they are all characterized by their emphasis on the single employer organizational bargaining. And it is important to recognize that the organizational bargaining may not be confined exclusively on one level, rather may itself be layered or at a combination of levels. So you can go for the conditions, and for example, there may be company level bargaining on general conditions, such as the pension, the holidays, and other concerns which are to apply to all the employees. And if you look at the plant side level bargaining on pay, which may vary in relation to site performance or site level, or you may go for local site level bargaining, plant or site level bargaining, or pay, which may then vary in relation to relations, and finally actual working arrangements. And then we go over to the nature of collective bargaining. The essential characteristics of collective bargaining is that the employees don't negotiate individually on their own behalf, but do so collectively through representatives. So it can only function in certain circumstances. What are they? Provided employees, what they do, they identify a commonality of purpose, they and organize, and they act in concert. Another circumstance could be, when we look at the management, and if the management is prepared to recognize their organization, management is accepting the change in the employment relationship, which covers, or at least uh, one can talk about the constraints, if at all there, and its ability to deal with employees on an individual basis. So, Joseph's sister has opined that the collective bargaining can best be analyzed by listing certain, I would say, uh, principal characteristics. So he has listed 5 characteristics. To start with, the first characteristics, that is, collective bargaining involves a group that you create and the relationship which you maintain among the groups, and it is both continuous and evolutionary, and again it interacts with the socio-economic climate, and it is private, and at times involves government actions, no doubt about it, and it varies from setting to setting. So that is why in collective bargaining, the employer doesn't deal with workers directly, but the but he deals with the collective authorized institutions. So it is an institution, or it is an institutional mechanism rather, I would say, for the purpose of fixing of your price of labor services, or establishing a system of industrialization, or establishing a system of industrial prejudice. And finally, we have to see, does it provide a machinery representation of the individuals and the group interest. So in fact, it covers the entire range of organized relationship, that too between the union and the management, including your negotiation, including your administration. Similarly, the interpretation normally we go for, and the application of agreement, enforcement of agreement, and we always insist upon the written agreements. So it sets forth the joint understanding as to policies, joint understanding as to the procedures, what should be the mechanism, modus operandi, so far as governing wages, so far as rates of pay, so far as your any sort of other conditions of employment. So it is recognized as the central institution rather, or you may call it as heart of industrial relation in all democratic nations. So collective bargaining is essentially a multi-dimensional institution And in that case, what is happening that the union security, they try to protect the degree of control also being exercised. The scope is quite wide. So further, he argued that the dimensions of collective bargaining as themselves mainly, these are all in fact determined uh, in the process by the structure of management and the employers organization taken together. Now coming to the contents, what should be the contents of collective bargaining? Collective bargaining is among other, you can say, self rule making, among other things, because collective, when we talk about the contents of collective bargaining, it is something among other things, a rule making or norm creating process of bilateral kind. That is why collective bargaining, when it is bargained, uh, rules, they are of two kinds, namely either procedural or it is substantive. So procedures, obviously you have to go for the procedural rules as the term implies, and you set out the procedures, and those procedures, they govern the behavior um, of the employer as well as promote the behavior of the unions. So they cover all procedural matters, no doubt about it, to organization and the contents of the organization. So the aspect that is to be seen, that is your substantive, because the fact remains that when we talk about the first rule, they cover all the uh, procedures, matters relating to negotiation of contracts. If at all you feel some kind of modification is to be brought about, keeping in view the organization, a renewal, your transmittal, everything to be extended by the union officers in in order to see that they are all concerned with the substance of the agreements with the union and the management. They always try to work out. So the three different kinds of relationship which are regulated by the substantive rule, that is the economic and the market relationship, that is your government relationship, that is your workplace relationship. Now, coming to the types of collective bargaining, there are two types of collective bargaining. Normally, it is exercised. One is known as conjunctive or distributive bargaining, and the other one is known as integrative or cooperative bargaining. No doubt, though both are they take part in the joint decision making, their processes are dissimilar. Because disruptive bargaining has the function of resolving your pure conflicts of interest. But the moment, since we are very much concerned about the technology that we are talking of, obviously the disruptive bargaining has the function of resolving pure conflicts of interest. So it stops the how to allocate the fixed sums of resources, and hence one has win-lose quality. But by disruptive bargaining, the relationship is always a forced one, and that too, in which the attainment of one party's goal appears to be basic conflict with the parties of the other. So it deals with some kind of, you can say, agreement where there should not be any kind of conflict of interest, and it deals with issues, and those issues in which parties have conflicting interests, and each party, in fact, uses its corrective power, and that corrective power is always considered to be a maximum extent possible. And in such a situation, one party's gain is the other's lose. So if we look at the wage bargaining, which is the obvious example of your disruptive or conjunctive bargaining, in contrast to the win-lose syndrome of the disruptive bargaining. So by talking of integrative bargaining, we are very much concerned with the solution of problems and those problems confronting both the parties. So if I would be interested to be more specific in a situation where neither party can gain unless the other party gains as well, as obviously integrative bargaining has the function of finding who is that common or complementary interest, the providing for the joint gain, providing for joint success, and hence often as a win-win quality, and it makes the problem solving approach in which we find that both the parties make a positive joint effort to their mutual satisfaction, and your productivity bargaining is an instant is an instance of your integrative bargaining. So now coming to the bargaining theories and the models, the number of bargaining models have their roots in the social psychology, and some of the theories of models, they range from your descriptions of what occurs at the bargaining table to very, very complex theories that make extensive use of your mathematical models, your economic models. So, on that aspect, I would like to give a brief description of this simple collective bargaining model as a whole. So, first theory goes in the name of Walton and McCarthy's theory. So, here the orientation of the person, what we look at, the orientation person is taking the help of more extensive use of mathematical models, taking the maximum use of your economic models. So that is why I start with your Walton McCarthy theory. As per them, they view collective bargaining as a four sub-processes. One is your distributive, then your bargaining, then your integrative, and finally your attitudinal structuring. I started with distributive, through bargaining, through integrative bargaining, through attitudinal structuring, and through intra-organizational or intra-organizational bargaining. So your distributive bargaining, it applies to situation where you find that the union and management goals, union goal and the management goals, they are all in conflict. So integrative bargaining, on the other hand, refers to bargaining issues and not necessarily in conflict with whether win those of the other party or not. So we also go for this attitudinal structuring, that is a kind of means, by the your bargaining parties, your consultative or your cultivative friendliness, your trust, your respect, the cooperation you extend. So this is the final sub process, and that too in Walton and McCarthy theory. That is intra-organizational bargaining, wherein the focus is on interaction that is taking place between the union and management. So there are four sub-processes, rather I would say, interact with each other to help in shaping the final outcome of the collective bargaining, as well as long-term relationship between the units and the bargains. So in that case, if I go for this bargaining range theory, it has its root with the late professor A.C. Pigou. Pigou bargaining range theory explains the process by which labor and management they describe what should be the upper wage limits and what should be under wage limits. So, in fact, in the process within which a settlement, final settlement is always made. So the fact remains, when we are talking about bargaining theory, we also look at the management, and management will offer nothing but the wage that is well below the acceptable version of the economic aspects. Because these two, if you look at, one is offering wage which should not be below the acceptable, which is below, should not be below something which is acceptable to the unions. But if we look at both, there are two extremes. The union management teams will normally process through your series of proposals, then counter proposals, everything. But now we find that the union is gradually reducing its wages and demands, while the employer, that what we are looking for, will raise its wage. So both sides will be at peace, and the both sides, however, have established some kind of limits, and some kind of limits to the far and your far success if at all we go for collective bargaining. So, according to this theory, the exact settlement which we may go for, the settlement point, will depend on the bargaining skills, which depend on the strength of actual management, the bargaining, only the bargaining skill, or the strength of the management negotiators. So another model is your Chamberlain model, and here the model, what it does, the model's focus is on something else. It focuses upon the determinants. What are the determinants of bargaining power, and the way in which changes in these determinants finally lead to some kind of settlement in the majority of your collective bargaining situations. So Chamberlain defines bargaining power as the ability to secure your opponent's agreement to your terms. So that is why a unions, if you look at the union's bargaining power, obviously it can be defined as the management willingness to agree to the union's terms, to agree to the union's demand. But what determines this willingness, or what determines their unwillingness of management? It is only to agree to the unions about the terms of employment, about the conditions of employment. So obviously the answer, according to that, the answer will depend on how, or the cost aspect of disappearing or disagreeing with the union's labor power, and the second one, that is your, if the management is going to estimate that it is more costly to agree than to disagree. That is, if the union's bargaining power is less than, or management will choose to disagree, then in that case, you will not be able to bear because thereby reject the union's terms. If, however, we are talking of management judges that it is more costly to disagree than to agree, that means if the union's bargaining power is greater than one, obviously in that situation, management will choose to agree. So management's bargaining power, if I look at, can similarly be defined um, that union's perceived cost of disagreeing, managements with the management terms, and that is to be divided by the union's perceived cost of agreeing with the management terms. And once again, it would be appropriate to mention that if the union believes that it is more costly to agree than to disagree, obviously the union also will disagree with the management's offer. But whenever the denominator that is greater than the numerator in the equation, then in that case, whenever the management's bargaining power is less than one, and the union will choose to reject management's offers. So conversely, if the union judges is to be more costly to disagree than going for agreement, than to agree, then the union, what will do, will choose to agree. So in other words, the same thing can be put that when management's bargaining power is greater than one, obviously the union will be willing to accept management's offer. So the union cost of disagreeing and the union cost of agreeing can be defined similarly to those of management. So that is why Chamberlain bargaining power model has provided a number of salient implications. At least one party must perceive disagreement to be more costly than your agreement in order for the agreement to occur. And secondly, to one's bargaining power is relative in that it depends on the size of the wage increase one is asking for or one is offering. The third is the misjudgment, you can say, judgment of the maximum offer the employer will make or the minimum offer union will accept, either of the case, or the commitment that we are talking of, commitment the parties to irreconcilable positions may result in a strike even, though the range of mutual, the range of mutually acceptable settlements exist, or your compromise offers and the demands and the approach of the bargaining deadline both they tend to make a move the parties towards agreement. Obviously, the model allows the coercive tactics using force with increase your opponent's cost of agreements. And apart from that, also the economic movement, including both the state of the macro economy and industry structure, can also affect the bargaining power of the two parties. Similarly, another model is there, that is your Hicks bargaining model. Here, Hicks focuses on the length of work stoppage, focuses on the stoppage of work stoppage. So Hicks has proposed that union and management negotiation uh, should be a balanced one, and the cost and the benefit that we are more concerned about, that to offer a benefit of a work stoppage, if we consider when making some kind of concessions at the bargain table, then what would be the outcome, that each of the or each side makes concessions. Only the purpose is to avoid a war stoppage. So the central idea is that there is a functional relation between the wage and on the not the company parties, and the another aspect is there is a particular wage that provided to the employer, and the particular wage the employer would prefer if the union were not in the picture, and he will concede more, however, in order to avoid strike, because that is going to affect the entire organization, and up to a point, when there is a uh, elasticity, and the elasticity doesn't make a move any further, so his concessions will rise with the length of strike that you are going to anticipate. So a prime difference between the Hicks model and the bargaining range theory is that Hicks model is pinpointing the precise ways settled, and the bargaining, talking of the range theory, uh, that means the precise, because if you look at the Higgs model and the bargaining range theory, is that Higgs model pinpointing precise wage settlement, so you know how much to be decided, while the range theory doesn't do that. So having discussed about the different theories of bargaining model, and now let us go over to the elements of collective bargaining. I would say there are three elements in the system of collective bargaining. So the first element, we look at what are the issues for consideration. And when I talk about the issues for consideration, obviously the issues pertaining to your union recognition, issues pertaining to your um, union security, because they come up for consideration when the organization of workers, they are all found very weak in the process of consultation, in the process of giving them demands, and they always struggle for the recognition by the employers. So the issues which are generally taken off for the purpose of consideration, they are on the several aspects of employment relationship. What could be those aspects of employment relationship, such as your wages, such as your fringe benefits, such as your working conditions, such as certain personal matters like your promotion, like your transfer from one place to another place, like your discharge, like your dismissal. The second element would be the procedure for consideration. So, the bargaining machinery that we are talking of, the procedure for consideration of various issues, they differ in relation to whether the two parties, who are they, the employers and the management, who are they, they are the workers and their unions. What they do, they conduct bargaining on their own. What they do, whether a third party such as government intervenes to bring about a settlement between them or not. And the third element of the collective bargaining is the collective agreements. Collective agreements and their implementation. The term collective agreement, what does it mean? It means all agreement, that too in writing, regarding working conditions, all agreements in writing, that too regarding terms of employment, all concluded between the employer, a group of employers, or one of more employers, similarly, or the organizations. On the other hand, one or more, you can say, the representative workers' organizations, or in the absence of such organizations, the representative of the worker who is duly elected and who is duly authorized by them, and that too in accordance with the rules and regulations. And in all these cases, organization on the other hand, when they talk with the one or more representative of the workers' organizations, or in the absence of such organization, the representatives of the organization who is elected duly and also authorized by them, then in that case, what we do, that is in accordance with your national laws, that is in accordance with your national regulations. On the other, you can refer to international labor organizations, what kind of um, outcome they have received, consensus have been reached. So collective bargaining agreement may be described in a number of ways. It is a compromise between your self-interest of the two parties, and they have also agreed upon the compromise normally one will go for, because it is a compromise between your self-interest and self-interest of the two parties, and they have agreed upon as the guide to their uh, maybe their relationship on certain issues, certain matters, and should always try to how to resolve those matters. There should not be any kind of conflict of interest, and the solution should be obtained within a specified period of time. So these collective agreements, when we are talking of the pattern of collective agreement, may vary from country to country depending upon the scope of legislation of the country where the agreement is signed and the levels at which the agreement is negotiated, plant level, organization level, or industry level to which it is to apply, and above all, the government policy. What is the government policy towards labor? What is the government policy towards industrial relations? And what is the government policy towards your propensity of the parties to bargain with each other? So negotiations have to decide at which level the collective agreement has to be applied. So that is why to the undertaking, either or the plant or to the work site or a particular place, uh, when I say place or an area, where I talk about country, the whole country. In some countries, negotiation at the level of a single who is single undertaking, who are considering to be more appropriate in view of your special conditions, in view of prevailing conditions there. So the contents when we are talking of the collective bargaining may considerably vary from plant to plant, from industry to industry, and usually they cover items relating to wages, they cover items relating to working conditions, they cover items relating to working hours, in fact, or they cover items like your fringe benefits, items like your job security. So legally, collective agreement in fact binds only the parties to it, and the person on behalf of whom we normally they were acting, and it is often it happens that all the workers in a given undertaking may not belong to the union which signed the agreement, and that they are non-unionized. So that is why a number of countries, the we have law. The law provides for compulsory coverage of agreement, compulsory coverage of your settlement of the employees and all the employees in the establishments. So in the process, we always look at the consent, awards, agreements, and that is to be reached between the parties. When the matters in disputes, they are under reference to industrial tribunal, they are under reference to industrial courts. So with this, we come to an end of today's session. Thank you very much. Have a nice time. Good day.